Well, good evening everyone and welcome to St Francis Xavier Parish Hall. We're continuing our series on St Mark's Gospel under the general idea that it's really a declaration of war. His rather beleaguered Jewish, non-Jewish or Gentile community of recently baptised followers of Jesus Christ are under a lot of pressure from the Roman Empire, and hence we saw last week that the very beginning of the Gospel is almost a word-for-word challenge to the adulation of the Roman Emperor. And then we looked at a couple of other instances where Jesus takes on the social order of the day and really wages war against that, elevating the status of a nameless woman who is suffering from a hemorrhage of blood, above hastening, as his disciples wanted him to do, to the house of a synagogue official, a male advocate for his daughter, Jairus by name. Anyway, we dealt with that. And I forget what the third thing was that we dealt with, but no doubt we've got another three. And today I'm going to look at, firstly, Jesus warring against the idea of holiness which was prevalent in his society. You know, there are many societies where religious leaders and traditions think that some people or some foods are such that they're a threat to the holiness of their followers. They're to be avoided, otherwise they defile their followers and render them unclean and unfit, therefore, to engage in community activities like communal worship or even just ordinary community activities. The most obvious one that we all know about is, for a Jewish person, anything derived from a pig, pork, bacon, etc., is not kosher, and to eat that, I suppose even to touch a pig, would render you unclean, defiled. Anyway, they're obvious examples which I think most of us are aware of. There's a terrible situation in India at the moment where people at the bottom of the caste system who are Catholic are challenging their local bishop because the cemetery, for example, is divided into caste system. So the untouchables and those at the bottom of the caste system cannot be buried alongside people higher in the caste system in a Catholic cemetery. I mean, they haven't come across this particular passage or haven't taken it to heart, as we will see. Now, I mentioned last time that all the evidence seems to be that the community that Mark was writing for was Jewish and non-Jewish. And that explains why when you hear this passage read, Mark has to go into a long explanation of some Jewish customs. If it was just a Jewish Christian community, they'd know. But the non-Jews have to be told. So let's hear the passage, which is Mark 7, 1-8 and 21-23, and keep that in mind, the audience to whom it is directed.
Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered round him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders, and they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" And he said, "It is what comes out of a person that defiles them. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within and make a man unclean.
So for Jesus, there's a radical break with the Jewish tradition about what renders a person unclean, unworthy to be part of the chosen people worshipping God in the temple or at prayer services, scripture services we might call them, in the synagogues. Okay? Jesus' whole approach was radically different and was very important for Mark's community, as we'll see in a moment. But think for a moment even to what we looked at last week. Jesus is touched by a woman hemorrhaging blood. Now, under Jewish tradition, that would have rendered him unclean, would have defiled him. But in fact, healing power flowed from him to the woman. Far from his being defiled, she is healed in that touching, if I could use it in many senses, in that touching moment. And further in that story, do you remember that Jesus takes the little girl, the 12-year-old girl, by the hand and lifts her? He touched a corpse. That was terribly defiling. Explains, of course, part of the Good Samaritan story, where the priest and the other official passed by the man who was left for dead by the side of the road. They'd better not touch the corpse, they would be defiled. Okay? So Jesus, in fact, of course, in touching the girl and commanding her to rise out of her sleep, which we discussed last week, life flows from him, not defilement from her to him. And there are so many instances where he's healing lepers or having a meal with tax collectors, the despised tax collectors for the Roman Empire, and notorious sinners. He's not worried about who he's sharing a meal with. The fact is the meals he is sharing with them are for him anticipations of the marriage banquet of heaven. So, for us to become holy, we don't quarantine ourselves or cut ourselves off from particular people or foods or whatever, just by categorising them, in labelling them this or that. Rather, we have to put ourselves in the way of Jesus so that he can touch us, so that the contagion of holiness flows from him to us. There are various ways to do this, of course. To immerse oneself in the Gospels, to receive the risen Lord in Holy Communion, to perceive him in the vulnerable, the downtrodden, those without the necessities of life. Matthew 25, if I can jump to that Gospel. There are various ways in which we can put ourselves in the path of Jesus. And that means that we're within the range of being, I was going to say contaminated by him. Catch the holiness from him to us. Get what I mean? So that we become holy in what sense? Well, the Oxford English Dictionary I looked up a couple of days ago, it says holy, morally and spiritually excellent or perfect, to be revered. Have you got that on the screen? Holy, morally and spiritually excellent or perfect, to be revered. Probably explains why I'm called Reverend, but maybe not. But what do we mean by perfect? That's the question. it's not exactly insipid, but it's not very attractive, is it? Morally and spiritually perfect. I mean, A, it's probably unattainable in our heads, and B, there's nothing worse than a goody-goody, is there? To use a primary school expression. But the word for perfect, certainly in the Gospels, I haven't got the spelling correct, but it's something like Telos. Telos, something like that in Greek. And it refers, for example, if you talk about a perfect wine, you mean one that's been, well, the grapes have been harvested, trodden, put in barrels, matured over a number of years, and then it emerges as a perfect wine. In other words, it's matured enough to be what a good wine should be. So for the Gospels, for a person to be perfect means that they have attained what a human being should be. And of course, it won't be overnight. It could be ages and ages. What's 79 by 365? You know, I'm still on the way, I'm still maturing. So to be perfect is to be everything that a human being is meant to be. But that can take time, and there can be difficulties with the maturing process, as in the production of any good wine. Okay? So Jesus, of course, is perfectly what a human being, and of course he's in the closest relationship. The person of Jesus Christ is both God and human being. But he's perfectly what a human being should be, can be, as an image of God, in the likeness of God, in human terms, bound by time and space. That's our objective. But we need the life force to come from the one who is undoubtedly holy, in that sense, everything that a human being should be. We have to put ourselves in the way of that life force coming into our life. I've mentioned the Gospels, the sacraments, the poor. And then we're in a good position to refute the commonly misunderstood idea: the good works make us holy. No, our being mature produces good works. See, it's the other way around. Good works can't make anyone holy. But if we go through the difficult process, like the making of a good wine, to become more mature as human beings, then good works will flow from that. Okay. Well, I think that's all I need to say, except to make the point once again. Let's always put these stories in context. A Jewish Christian community. They wanted to sit down together. They wanted to be in each other's companionship. Companion is just the Latin, I think, com, with, pan, bread. Bread sharers, the with bread people. So the Jews and the Gentile early Christians wanted to share meals together, sit together. St. Peter in the Acts of the Apostles found it very difficult to come to grips with that. He resisted for as long as he could. Then he had a vision and caved in, as it were, to God's way of looking at human beings, rather than the separation as being the way in which people's holiness was guaranteed. Very important, this story, from the Markan community. They can break bread together. companionship with bread people, bread sharers, and of course preeminently sharers in the bread of life. Okie doke. So that's one story for tonight. Oh, here's another one. This is the story that is most often misunderstood. In the Gospels, there's one commandment that's never observed. That is, do not swear an oath. It's very clear. But does anyone pay any attention to that? Not many. Senator Tate did, and he was berated when he didn't take the oath on the Bible when he entered into the Senate because he just made the affirmation. But it's all based on St Matthew's Gospel. Do not swear an oath. Anyway, that's one of the, I'm a bit off track, that's one of the commandments that's not much observed. Here's one of the passages in the Gospels which is often not very well read and therefore understood. Partly the church's fault, or largely the church's fault. Do you want to have a crack at it?
Yeah.
Yeah, you need to come up here.
Yeah, sure.
What I want you to do, oh wait there, wrong one. Here we are, 12:38:44. Just read that in a very bland, that part.
Yep.
Down to 11, in a very bland, uniform tone.
I trust you'll tell me if it's not bland enough.
Yeah, he sat down.
He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the treasury. And many of the rich put in a great deal. A poor widow came and put in 2 small coins, the equivalent of a penny. Then he called to his disciples and said to them, I tell you solemnly, this poor widow has put more in than all who have contributed to the treasury. For they have all put in money they had over. But she, from the little she had, has put in everything she possessed, all she had to live on.
Okay. Normally, say that, please. Normally, that's what we hear, the story of the widow's mite. And generally, the little widow gets a pat on the head for being so devout and generous. And then the parish priest says, we need to raise more money for the parish. Be like the little widow. Okay, all right. But that's not the context. The context starts a couple of verses prior, and it reveals Jesus in white-hot anger. So I want you to read the relevant parts in an angry tone, please. Yeah. Particularly, yeah. But anyway, in his teaching.
Yep. In his teaching, Jesus said, beware of the scribes who like to walk about in long robes, to be greeted obsequiously in the market squares, to take the front seats in the synagogues and the places of honour at banquets. These are the men who swallow the property of widows while making a show of lengthy prayers. The more severe will be the sentence they receive.
Keep going, but read it now in that same...
He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the treasury, and many of the rich put in a great deal. A poor widow came and put in 2 small coins, the equivalent of a penny. Then he called to his disciples and said to them, I tell you solemnly, this poor widow has put more in than all who have contributed to the treasury. For they have all put in money they had over, but she, from the little she had has put in everything she possessed, all she had to live on.
You see the context now? Jesus has been railing against the scribes, who are the lawyers, basically, for, when a woman was left a widow in that society, she was particularly vulnerable. So the scribes, of course, could get up to all sorts of mischief, fraudulently dealing with the property and so on and so forth. And he rails against that. They swallow the property of widows. That's the scribes. Then there he is sitting in the temple grounds, and they had these tubes like an inverted trumpet, a trumpet's got a... And people would throw money in the tube, or tubes. And he sees this poor widow throwing in a few coins. And he's ropeable. Because what she's left destitute. She's got nothing to live on. It says she's got nothing to live on. She can't afford the necessities of life. Now, in her own person, she may have been, I have no doubt, was a very devout person, and she had thought this was the right thing to do. But she was being brainwashed by the temple authorities and system. You see? I mean, no temple official who even had a passing acquaintance with the prophets, for example, would know that widows and orphans are the particular concern of those with some power or money. They are to look after them. And here in the temple, it was exactly the opposite. This poor widow was left destitute. So really, it's a shocking situation. It's exploitation of this woman. And when the church forgets this story and reads it in the wrong tone, pat on the head, and not in anger, then a catastrophe follows for the church. Let me give an example. Are there any Anglicans here? Any Protestants? Oh, well, let me give you a bit of your history, since you're not here. In 1517, Pope Leo X needed to raise money, big money, for the building of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. No way, he was a Medici, so, he was used to big money, but there wasn't enough money. So he authorised preachers to go out and sell indulgences. In other words, to market the forgiveness of sins, either your own sin or some soul in purgatory, as it was put. Okay? So that was a way of raising money. I mean, it's shocking. It was particularly promoted by a Dominican. I love the Dominicans. Timothy Radcliffe is my best friend amongst the cardinals. Well, he's the only cardinal I know. But I love Timothy Radcliffe. But back then, it was a Dominican who most vigorously preached the idea you threw a few coins in, and as you did so, you released a soul from purgatory. Oh, man. Anyway, the travelling circus hit Wittenberg, and Martin Luther was not much pleased. So he put up his thoughts about it on the door of the cathedral, famous nailing of the theses to the door of the cathedral, which was like a public notice board. And that's the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Wouldn't have occurred if Pope Leo X and the Medicis and their likes had taken this to heart. It was the exploiting of the poor, in that case in Germany, in order to build this grandiose structure, which I quite admire, in Rome. Yes. Of course, it means, of course, that the early Christian community had to operate by in a different way. And we read in the Acts of the Apostles, particularly chapter 2 and chapter 4, how the early church, if necessary, sold their property in order to give to the poor, to make sure that there was a proper distribution of goods for the poor. And in fact, I think it's in chapter 6 of Acts of the Apostles, the first deacons in the church were appointed precisely to look after the non-Jewish widows who were being neglected in the distribution of food and whatever. That's why deacons emerged in the early church, to look after the non-Jewish widows who were being put to one side. Well, this obviously has repercussions, has a meaning for us even in a little parish, miles and miles and miles away from Mark's little community, and certainly from the temple system, which, as you know, was destroyed in AD 70 with the sacking of Jerusalem. But even in our parish, we have to be careful when we allocate money, for example, as we did, is it 4 or 5 years ago now, for the repainting of the interior of the church, and it was in pretty poor condition. But even so, it could have been tolerated, but I suppose. But it did need to be repainted, and the whole situation cleaned up and more focused for liturgical purposes, but it could not have been done, should not have been done, without the concurrent building of the 8 affordable housing units for women over 55. You know, if we'd gone ahead with that without some corresponding social justice activity, particularly in this case dealing with vulnerable women, then, well, if we'd gone ahead without doing that, we would have ignored this gospel. And the church is always in danger of that. I've got a lovely example in this week's newsletter, so please come to Mass 9 a.m. on Sunday morning. I've got a quote here somewhere. Yeah, from Jeremiah. This is to do with the temple. Put no trust in delusive words like these, the sanctuary of Yahweh, if I may use that. But if you do amend your behaviour and your actions, if you do not exploit the stranger, the orphan and the widow, then here in this place I will stay with you. Well, of course, the presence of God did not stay in the temple. It's part of the symbolism in the, I think, in the rending of the curtain at Christ's death, that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple precinct. It was a way of showing that God was not especially present in the temple, but of course is present in what was happening on Golgotha, and then even more in the risen Lord. All right, okay. We've got to be careful of that. Where are we now? Well, I preached on this on Sunday simply because it came up in the lectionary. But the Transfiguration. I've headed the idea, War Against Bodiless Religion. War Against Bodiless Religion. And I've taken the Transfiguration as the key story to illustrate that. You know, a lot of great world religious traditions believe that well, put it this way, as I mentioned on Sunday, I don't know how many times people say to me, Father, but all religions are the same really, aren't they? Just different paths to the same end. And if I'm in a mood, I say, no, they're not. The ends envisaged can be very, very different. In particular, some forms of Buddhism, for example, the meditation practices, mindfulness, as they call it, and awareness, super-awareness of where you're treading as you walk, that's all very good and perhaps very soothing for the soul, for the person. But for example, for many forms of Buddhism, the end goal is what we can loosely call nirvana, a situation where the individual person, Michael Tate, no longer exists, but is caught up, or is enveloped, is or is not in this state of semi-existence, if that, but where his personal identity is lost. And that's the aim. And to get there, of course, you've got to do away with as many attachments to people and to possessions as possible, which is a good discipline. But as I say, the aim is very different. Plato, of course, infected the whole Christian tradition. Plato said, and I may get the Greek a little bit wrong, but the soma, estin, I think it's estin, is, there's a word missing I can't think of, is a sema. Soma means body, psychosomatic. Soma is body in Greek. Sema is prison. So that for Plato, the best thing that could ever happen for a person is that the soma be released from the prison of the body. Leave it behind like a carcass, and the soma, and the soul can then drift off into contemplation of the true and the beautiful. Get what I mean? I hope I got that right. The soma is the body, it's a prison, and the whole idea is that the psyche, the soul, needs to be liberated from that prison. And, you know, to be honest, even when I was a boy, a long time ago, I think I more or less thought heaven was where souls flitted around. I don't know how they flitted around exactly, but heaven was the habitat of souls. And you pray for the souls in purgatory and then they go to heaven, something like that. That was the idea. But St. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest Catholic theologian, Christian theologian, says, if only my soul is saved, I am not saved. Because I go on now, my words, because I am, what is a human being? How do you like this? As one word, like an email address, a body soul. A human being is a body soul. We're a composite body soul. The terrible thing about death is, of course, that these are wrenched apart. That's what death is all about. The wrenching apart of the human being, the body-soul. For Catholics and the Orthodox, the Greek and the Russian Orthodox, there's one exception in our tradition, and that is Mary. Mary makes the transition to heavenly existence without the wrenching apart of body and soul. We call it the Assumption. You with me? But for us, body, souls, that's who we are, and that's who... If I'm to be saved, ultimately, it's not in some ocean of being or something like that, just like a little drop in the ocean which can't be differentiated from the ocean, actually. No, I, Michael Tate, have to be saved, body, soul. With me? Now, therefore, when we come to the story of the Transfiguration, it's very important for this idea. Do you want to have somebody else want to have a crack at it? No? Okay. Have another go.
I did last week.
This is Mark 9, 2-10.
Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain where they could be alone by themselves. There in their presence he was transfigured. His clothes became dazzlingly white, whiter than any earthly bleacher could make them. Elijah appeared to them with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Then Peter spoke to Jesus. "Rabbi," he said, "it is wonderful for us to be here. So let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. And a cloud came, covering them in shadow. And there came a voice from the cloud. "This is my Son, the Beloved. Listen to him." Then suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus.
This is obviously a true mystical experience for Jesus. But it's not an out-of-body mystical experience. It's very much an embodied mystical experience. His whole visage is transfigured. And even his clothes become dazzling white. By the way, well, I'll come to that if you remind me about his clothes. But I just want to focus on the fact that, you know, a lot of people think of Jesus as divine, which is good and true, and that his body was sort of like a shroud put over him, a bit like Ned Kelly's shield, you know. It was just his body sort of covered his divinity, but really, and then in the Transfiguration somehow his divinity shines through. No. In the Transfiguration we see that every molecule of Jesus' body was translucent with divine light. The body itself is the locus for divine light and glory. In fact, St. Irenaeus of Lyon says, "The glory of God is a living human being." It's often misquoted as, "The glory of God is a man fully alive." It's not there in the Latin. It's a human being. The glory of God is a human being is a living human being. A truly living human being, we might say. Hence the misquote. So when we look at the Transfiguration, we see what we have already seen in the previous talk or two. A fully mature human being, everything a human being should be, is capable of being immersed in divine light and glory. And therefore your body is translucent and transformed by that. That's what the Transfiguration is about. It's the body that's important. Okay? The interesting thing is that as Oliver was concluding the story, what we hear here, somehow an auditory vision, I was going to say, an auditory mystical experience shared by the disciples. This is my son, the beloved. Where have we heard that before? At the baptism of Jesus. Once again, we get this imagery of the heavens opening, something like a dove, or in dove-like fashion, not a fluttering bird, but in dove-like fashion, this peace descends on Jesus. But the words I want to concentrate on, and a voice is heard, this is my beloved son. My favour rests on him, I think, something like that. What's the difference? The difference is in the Transfiguration, you had the additional words, listen to him. Listen to him. So, I've never read a satisfactory theology of confirmation until I read my own notes here before coming in. Because when you think about it, what are we doing? We're confirming the baptismal situation of the person being confirmed. But they're of an age where, knowing the identity of Jesus, the beloved Son, they should listen to him. That's what confirmation should be about. A resolution to listen to the beloved Son. And then we have a prospect of listening and imitating the beloved Son and preparing ourselves as best we can for sharing in this transfigured existence. Now, is it possible, it's all very well if it's a post-mortem event, please God it will be for each one of you and me, but is it possible even now? Well, we all know the stories of St. Francis of Assisi and Padre Pio, how because of their devotion to the crucified and poor Christ, they themselves bore the stigmata, the wounds of the crucifixion in their bodies, correct? We all know those stories, those facts. Is it possible for a human being to be so devoted to and so close to God that they share in the Transfiguration, just as St. Francis of Assisi and Padre Pio shared in the crucifixion, as it were, bodily? Well, here's a story from St. Seraphim of Sarov, a Russian saint. Seraphim, is it there? Did I write it down? Yes, it is. So you've got it there in your notes. Saint Seraphim of Sarov. A disciple of Saint Seraphim in Russia tells us this story. They're standing in a snow-covered field. And Seraphim says to his follower, "Why then, my friend, do you not look me straight in the face? Look freely without fear. The Lord is with us." The disciple reports, "Encouraged by these words, I looked and was seized by holy fear. Imagine in the middle of the sun, dazzling in the brilliance of its noontide rays, the face of the man who is speaking to you. You can see the movement of his lips, the changing expression of his eyes. You can hear his voice, you can feel his hands holding you by the shoulders, but you can see neither his hands nor his body. Nothing except the blaze of light which shines around, lighting up with its brilliance the snow-covered meadow and the snowflakes which continue to fall unceasingly." "What do you feel?" asked Father Seraphim. "An immeasurable well-being," I replied. "But what sort of well-being? What exactly?" "I feel," I replied, "such calm, such peace in my soul that I can find no words to express it." Seraphim responds, "My friend, it is the peace our Lord spoke of when he said to his disciples, 'My peace I give to you, the peace which the world cannot give, the peace which passeth all understanding.' What else do you feel?" "Infinite joy in my heart." My dear friends, that's the promise made to each one of you personally and individually, that you are to feel infinite joy in your hearts as fully matured human beings in the image of God, in the likeness of God. Body, souls. Infinite joy in your hearts. You and I will be, with God's grace, body, souls, you see, radiant with divine light, translucent to divine glory, filled with immeasurable well-being, infinite joy in our hearts. Thank you.